slide. Just be holding slide and then I'll count you in. YouTube. Else when we get room, sure or not.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our board members, the Chief Constable and his team, who are all joining us through Zoom today. And welcome to all of those who are watching this live streamed policing board meeting. This is a continuation of this morning's meeting. We had an early start at 8:30 to facilitate the recall of the Northern Ireland Assembly at 12. We had a full turnout of all 19 members at the private session, but unfortunately it's simply not possible for all to make it to this rescheduled session given the time change, and that is the reason why we have a few, not many, but a few who couldn't make it to the afternoon session. Chief Constable, we have a very detailed year-end report from you, which is now publicly available. However, the focus of discussions today is around the publication of the Public Prosecution Service statement on the policing of 4 COVID funerals, criticisms of policing and the actions of senior officers. Earlier in today's meeting, we had a lengthy discussion with yourself and DCC Mark Webster from Cumbria Constabulary around the investigation conducted and the file submitted to the Public Prosecution Service to gain a better understanding of the events and actions that were taken. Members have noted particular comments in the statement issued by the PPS around the clarity of the executive guidance in place at the time. Clearly, these things were not as clear as they may have been, and indeed this was also spelt out within our own report published in November 2020. Members have also questioned the engagement by the police with event organisers. As a result of our discussion earlier, the board has agreed to request the Justice Minister to commission HMICFRS, the Independent Inspectorate for Policing Services, to undertake a bespoke and urgent thematic inspection into the PSNI's handling of the policing of the funeral of Mr. Bobby Storey. Its operational decision-making, application of the law in the context of the COVID-19 regulations, and review the PSNI policy and procedures around police engagement with organisers and consistency of approach given the findings of the Public Prosecution Service. We hope that this review will provide swift assurance to us and to others in terms of the policing approach. Before we move to questions, can I remind members that we are not allowed to comment or any questions which are defamatory or would give rise to the real and substantial risk of procedural or prejudice any future litigation. I would also caution against questioning or comment in respect of the behaviour of any individual who may have been subject of the investigation and report, whether or not the person is named by the questioner. Questioning of the Chief Constable should be conducted in a manner which is proportionate, relevant and respectful and in order. So, having said all of that, Chief Constable, I hand over to you to make your introductory remarks.
Thank you much, Chair, and for the chance just to briefly say something. I'm conscious of time today, so I present my end-of-year report, as it were, to you, and I'll leave that in that place. Really, the issue in the room today, as you quite rightly say, is the response to the Public Prosecution Service's findings early in the week. And I want to place on record my clear and unequivocal understanding about the sympathy we have for the hurt, concern and anger felt by so many people who complied with the health protection regulations over the last year. Many people have endured the pain of being able to bury loved ones in the way that they would have liked. And I recognise that the events surrounding the policing of this funeral have caused outrage and have damaged confidence in policing. So I'm listening, but I'm confident that my officers have acted with good intent and integrity, managing what was always going to be a sensitive policing operation. I really welcome the engagement of Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Services as an independent body to come in and help us get an objective understanding of just what went on. I'm of course here to take questions today from you, but without second guessing where the review will go and its conclusions, we obviously are here to reflect and learn lessons, to see where we have to build bridges, but also to remind members that the PPS themselves, notwithstanding some of the public and political concern, found no evidence that deals were done in the run-up to this funeral. And I think I'll leave it there, Chair, to take questions.
Thank you, Chief Constable. Just as we go through the questions, I'm going to list the questioner who's coming up and then the one following so that people are ready for when they're called. And we're going to start by having questions from Mervyn Storey, and he will be followed by John Blair. So Mervyn Storey first. Mervyn.
Thank you, Chair. Chief Constable, I think none of us take any joy in being in the situation that we find ourselves today. But it needs to be reminded that after the Black Lives Matter, you issued an apology. Following the Ormer Road incident, you issued an apology. And unfortunately, on that occasion, you also publicly humiliated 2 of your own officers. The insensitivity to victims that was displayed when meeting with CRJ prior to the anniversary of the heinous murders of Corporals Wood and Howes, no apology. And so, Chief Constable, today, while my party leader has stated publicly what she believes should be the situation in regards to your position, will you take the opportunity to apologise to those many hundreds of families who were not afforded the privilege of police acquiescence or police assistance in terms of the letter or the spirit of the law? And let me, Chief Constable, read to you a comment from a constituent of mine who wrote to me yesterday, and he said, "I am disappointed but not surprised at the DPP decision. My dear wife died on the 13th of March, and there was absolute clarity in the arrangements. No more than 10 mourners, a closed house and a closed graveyard. The funeral director would have been in trouble if we had not abided by the rules. So along with perhaps the 2,000 other families, we are very annoyed. I hope you can pass this on to the appropriate authority." I'm doing that today, Chief Constable, because there are many people who are aghast at the compliance of the police in facilitating the most public display of the IRA on the streets of Northern Ireland. And I think that's a sad day for Northern Ireland.
Simon, if you'd like to respond.
There was an awful lot there, and I think the first thing I'd begin by saying, Chair, that I just repeat my opening comments, that it is a really regrettable situation that we find ourselves in, that we ourselves are still trying to make sense of. But absolutely, regardless of what HMIC find in a few weeks, what reflection we were able to do ourselves, clearly there are a number of issues at the heart of this. Firstly, everyone would have empathy with people that were unable to bury their loved ones in ways that we would traditionally expect. And not only have we got Mervyn's heart-rending account there for a constituent, but we have to remember, and we've all been part of listening to the news cycle, of how frequently people have expressed their concern about not being able to pay their respects at such an important time as a family, or indeed as a group of friends, when someone is buried and there's a funeral. We have recognised from the outset, actually, how difficult policing funerals may have been, which is why, actually, in the case of this particular course of events, one of the senior officers that was involved in the policing of the funeral actually commissioned work in the middle of April, both to get a clear understanding of the regulations that as they stood, and also to set in place a framework to show that we were even-handed in our dealings with different communities at such an important time of people's lives. Now, I am not in a position at the moment to second guess what HMIC will find, but I am clear that the PPS saw no evidence themselves of wrongdoing, and they saw no evidence of people being in this together, as it were. They made some commentary, and that's in their narrative, but they were at pains to state that individuals did not put themselves in jeopardy in that sense. So the words of collusion, facilitation, acquiescence, obviously I respect Mervyn's right to put that into the public domain, but unsatisfactory as the outcome has been, that wasn't something that police officers involved in this operation did, as far as I can certainly see, and all the narrative we've had thus far. So that we will, of course, now submit to the review and make our records available and give our account to the best of people's recollection. And I think before we determine that anyone has facilitated, acquiesced, or been in cahoots with anyone else, we need to let this process take its course. And I remind both Mervyn, yourselves, and indeed the wider public who inevitably are watching this, that even the other day, when we were first publicly aware of the conclusions of the PPS, who are independent and whose findings we have to respect, that we all said on that day that what happened was unnecessary, it was irresponsible, and it was insensitive, and it was wrong. And I think even in some of the commentary today we've held elsewhere, that people in the wider space also recognise that. So I think we are keen to try and allow the process to take its place, but also to recognise that we've got to still police the country this evening and in the weeks and days ahead.
The Chief Constable, do you accept in the conclusion, or one of the conclusions of the PPS, when you talk about that engagement, when they say that the extent of the engagement between the organisers and the police in the lead up to the event actually availed, those who took part availed of the reasonable excuse defence? So we will have over this weekend issues of concern in relation to possible other Republican parades. What engagement has there been there? What knowledge does the police have? And what action will the police take in ensuring that those illegal activities do not take place? Because the PPS clearly states that that engagement, and it talks about the extent of the engagement, led to there being no prosecutions. Is that not an indictment of a way that police should not be operating in Northern Ireland?
Well, again, this is probably the heart of the matter of public concern, Mervyn, and I recognise this and all the perceptions that go with it. I think turning forwards, it is to remind people that, that the regulations remain in place, and that our 4Es approach of that we've relied on since the early days of policing the COVID regulations remain. We still have a job to do to support the Health Minister to protect the public during this pandemic. So I think that's there. I think, to be quite candid, we were surprised professionally with the PPS conclusions, because again, I don't want to sort of fetter where HMIC will go, indeed, what we said. If we saw that as an outcome, that our tried and tested practice and procedure that does not apply to this funeral, but to a whole range of other public events, that we are actually trained to speak to organisers, to understand the detail of what's proposed, so that we can prepare an appropriate policing plan to whatever that event is. And we are now trying to make sense of what this really means for this approach, because it's the centre of not just doctrine here in Northern Ireland, but right across UK policing, that we would be expected to speak to organisers of whatever sort of event. That's been our practice in relation to funerals, where we've known of other funerals that potentially could breach the regulations. We've used that 3Es approach, if you like, of about engage, explain and encourage about what the regulations were. My understanding is that's what we did in this case. The PPS draw their conclusions, Mervyn, but this is what we're wrestling with now. To what extent could we have foreseen that by speaking to the organiser and to the event management company, this would afford that excuse? And that really, I suppose, is the heart of what HMIC FRS will now want to get to. We went into this endeavour with an intent to police the funeral in a sensitive but proportionate way, recognising there were risks. We went into this operation to gather evidence, which is what we did, in case there were breaches, because there was always that very real prospect. No one's pretending to a certain degree, if you like, we didn't see this coming. And then afterwards, we were really clear about this looked like a breach to us. The senior officer in charge, who is on the meeting today, made assumptions about breaches of leaving your home and being in a gathering. And then we began an investigation on that basis where we gathered evidence, we reviewed and assessed it. And gradually, as we understood that, we brought 24 people to interview with a clear recommendation on behalf of the Deputy Chief Constable that I appointed for a prosecution. We are where we are now, and obviously the PPS are reviewing their decision, and who knows where they may conclude, and we'll have to wait that too. But certainly, I think speaking for myself and for the Gold Commander, if we would have anticipated this is where we would have ended up, we may have taken an entirely different approach. But without trying to sound insensitive or flippant, we're now looking backwards. We have to really focus, as I'm sure HMIC will do, is what we did we do at the time that was reasonable and foreseeable that could have led us to this situation. Because even at that time, we were encouraging people to comply with the regulations, and we were using that graduated approach to demonstrate we were both listening but enforcing where we needed to, and we are where we are now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Next up is John, and John will be followed by Mike Nesbitt. John, Blair first.
Chairman, thank you. And can I also start by thanking the Chief Constable for the very extensive report he provided to the board today on a wide range of pressing policing matters, and in doing so express my hope that this board, through its public meetings, will be able to return to those pressing issues and give them the scrutiny they deserve in public in the very near future. The question is based on current events, of course, and mindful that the recent PPS report did not identify any wrongdoing on the part of the police. I hope today we can focus our deliberations on how we move forward from that report, and hope also that we do that in the same constructive spirit in which our private meeting was carried out this morning. So can I ask the Chief Constable, given the outcomes of those recent processes and the reference by the PPS in determining an outcome on whether or not to prosecute, can the Chief Constable commit to a review of the PSNI engagement processes conducted in a way that would identify any issues that are causing problems and remove any future problems?
Well, certainly, thank you, John. We are here to be reflective in terms of where we find ourselves, because we haven't got a tin ear despite some of the outrage and concern. And indeed, we have to be clear about what our policing response is going into this weekend. And we are very conscious of that. In the specifics, John, I think given the expectation that this review, a bit like events in London, will be a relatively quick one, I'll obviously take away time to think about this, but we're probably best served to wait and see if this is going to be a matter of weeks, which I'm presuming it is, that HMIC look at this, gather their thoughts and evidence and come back to the board, that we would want to wait that so we don't have to jump twice, because we can't presume where they'll end up. But at the moment, we still remain committed to the approach of no surprises when there are large events, because that's been at the heart of the police operational response way before even the COVID regulations, to try and minimise misunderstandings about intent and parameters, both of what people want to do and indeed police tactics and response, so that we are here to reflect and listen, but HMIC will now have a role to do to help us make sense of that as well.
Chair, if I can clarify there, I think that I have another issue to raise today, but I'm happy to move through the processes to which we're committed on this topic. And if there's time at the end, I'm content to wait until then for my additional question. But on this one, I take it the Chief Constable is saying then that we can have that review if we need to do that at the end of the HMIC process.
Absolutely. I mean, we will just have to wait and see the speed at which they're engaged and they can gather their evidence. And then they will come to their determinations. I wouldn't want to second guess this, John, but things happened pretty quickly when they did a very similar approach following events in London recently. And I would anticipate, I can't speak for HMIC, but I would anticipate that it would be a similar exercise here. So we do get an independent understanding of who said what to who and when, and the rights and wrongs of the general operational philosophy and practice.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. We will hopefully, if we have time, come back to the other questions that you have at the end, John. Thank you. Okay, next up is Mike, and Mike will be followed by Seán. So Mike next, Mike Nesbitt.
Chair, thank you. Chief Constable, in your short opening remarks, you made reference to the fact the PPS said no deals had been done between yourselves and the funeral organisers. Why then, in your interview on the radio with Stephen Nolan yesterday, did you make reference to negotiating?
Thanks for answering that, Mike, because it gives me a chance to clarify. That was a 20-minute interview where I could have described that better. There wasn't a negotiation. I was just trying to describe that on the 21st of June, the first occasion that we're aware of Mr. Storey's death, the Chief Inspector makes contact with a Sinn Féin representative to understand where Mr. Storey's remains are and where they're going. And that sets in train a series of events, only a few, as you were told this morning in the private meeting, about where Mr. Storey's remains were going, what were the general plans for his funeral, so that we could prepare a policing response. So I was just trying to describe that there'd been a series of short interactions, the most significant of which was no more than a 40-minute Zoom call on, I think it was, on the 29th of June, just to determine the final arrangements. So the sense of horse trading was probably what you heard from the word negotiation. I wasn't trying to imply that. I was trying to describe there was a fast time dialogue just to understand what the funeral arrangements were so that the commanders involved in that could make their risk assessments and prepare their plans and contingencies for that operation.
Thank you for the clarification. A sort of 4-point question, if I may, Chief Constable. When did you receive in writing the plan for the funeral? How did you assess it against compliance with COVID regulations? Did you, what was your assessment of the likelihood that a breach of regulations would occur on the day? And at what point and how did you prepare for evidence gathering?
I'll bring Alan in a minute because obviously he oversaw the operation in the run up to this. We received the plan from Sinn Féin, which is, I think, the one that's at the heart of this, I guess, at the moment, at 21:48 on the 28th of June. But do you just want to come in about some of those points of detail about evidence gathering and things, Alan?
Thanks, Chief. Thanks, Mike. Yeah, so the chief has pointed out, and I don't want to prevaricate on it, Mike. I mean, what I've seen on paperwork, what I saw at the time was as much a risk assessment conducted by the event managers as it was a plan. People will have their own language around it, but it wouldn't be what I would consider to be a plan of policing parlance. But it was received, and it did have some details in it. But it you know, like the chief said, it wasn't the basis for negotiation. We didn't ask for it. It was sent, and obviously we looked at it at that point. To your wider question, Mike, about at what point did I assess there was likely to be a breach of the regulations? I mean, I became aware of Mr. Storey's ill health and potential demise some days before he actually died, and it was probably my consideration and concern at the time that this was always likely to be a challenging funeral in terms of the number of people who would wish to attend it. And throughout that process, from the days before Mr. Storey died, right through the day itself, the working assumption in the planning team was whatever efforts were made by whatever party, by whatever event managers or whatever policing operation, we were likely to see some degree of the breach of the health protection regulations. And that was a consistent working assumption about that. And that, whilst even with the regulations changing potentially, and they were in flux with outdoor numbers going from 10 to 30, it was still my assessment that was likely to be the case. And therefore we set our mind to what the tactical options were in respect of that, one of which was evidence gathering. And so that was a planning assumption throughout the process, if that answers the question. If there's anything further you need.
Well, it was a question of when you and how you gathered the evidence, Alan.
So we looked at a range of opportunities around that, between CCTV camera, we considered aircraft, we considered placing Land Rovers on the route. We knew that there'd be extensive social media coverage and open source material. So we had just been working our way through that and deciding that that was going to be, and in fact, in any case, even if it hadn't been a working assumption, we would have been doing that in any case, because you cannot tell the time, and clearly you can't put that sort of thing together at a moment's notice. We did that throughout the planning process.
Okay, just finally then, in terms of the 4 E's, what would you say to people who say you may be engaged, but you didn't explain because you're saying that you were confused about the rules? You might not have encouraged, and you certainly didn't enforce.
And I understand that perception, Mike, and I welcome the opportunity to explain my take on it. In order, we did engage, and I don't think anybody's disputing that, and there obviously be HMI will give a view on the extent and the nature of that, and I look forward to that scrutiny going forward. In terms of explain, Mike, and I said this in a private meeting, but I welcome the opportunity to do this publicly. I was never confused about what I saw as the regulations on the day. Now, the subsequent judgment of PPS may show that my clarity was ill-founded, but I did have absolute clarity, and the working assumption for me and my team and the officers on the day was that any number at that funeral, and I wasn't drawing a distinction, and it's a PPS lawyer's job to do this more forensically, wasn't drawing a distinction between a funeral service and a funeral and a burial or any of those things. Our working assumption was anybody who gathered in numbers in over 30 at any aspect of that event on that day was likely to be breaching the health protection regulations. I was clear about that. My team were clear about that. And that's the basis which we planned and acted on the day. And any explanation we gave to others was on that basis. In other words, that's what they were consistently told. They were encouraged, and very, very clearly encouraged and made to understand that was my understanding, and the police would treat anything over and above that as a likely breach, and therefore would seek to enforce by way of follow-up, by way of investigation and prosecution. It was our chosen way of doing that. But I would, and I understand perception, and maybe people expect to see individual officers on a day with individual people stepping through 4 E's. I would say throughout the process, Mike, we engaged with the people who, and a standard practice with funeral directors, with organisers, with family members. We engaged with them. We explained that was our position. We encouraged them to stay to that position, and we said that with the likelihood, if we went over and above that they could expect some enforcement action, and that was our consistent position throughout the.
I appreciate the clarifications from both officers. Thank you very much, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Next up, we have Seán, and Seán will be followed by Joanne. But first, Seán Lynch. Seán.
Thanks, Chair. And my question is a slightly different subject. Simon, there's legal advice that states police do have the powers to rescind the fines issued to Black Lives Matters protesters. Should the PSNI now consider rescinding these fines? Thank you.
Thanks, Seán. I think the issue here is that we have separate legal advice that says, frankly, we can't. That because the fines have gone into the court after the penalty notices were issued, that it would be a matter for individuals to either contest the allegation which they face, or for the PPS, if they thought a ticket had been issued inappropriately, to withdraw it, and that we don't have that largesse. I know there's differing opinions flying around in relation to this, but the advice that we have been told to follow is in that space.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can we have the questions from Joanne, and Joanne will be followed by Dolores. So Joanne Bunting.
Thank you, Chairman. Chief Constable, can I first ask you, why did you not, further to my question this morning, why did you not ask if the organisers were asking people to stay away?
I think it's best that Alan just explains his operating parameters in relation to that, Joanne. Do you want to come in that space, Alan, if you're able to?
Chief, yes, thanks, and thanks, Joanne. As has been illustrated by the outworkings of the decision this week, Joanne, I mean, we were quite clear, some commentary at the time, and the commentary which has persisted since, that the engagement and what we were saying to organisers would be the subject of scrutiny before, during, and after the event. So, in supporting that 4E's approach, it was our job to explain what we saw as the regulations and to encourage people to comply with them. We were making various assessments of what the likelihood of that compliance was, but I didn't want my team to be getting into something that could be portrayed for what it wasn't. And going through individual pieces that people were or weren't doing. At the end of the day, people knew the law. They were encouraged to comply with it, and they were told if they didn't, then we would be looking at the enforcement options on the back of that. And that was our consistent position. So I personally, as the Gold Commander, don't get into that fine conversation with individuals about what steps they are or aren't taking. Because actually that starts to reinforce the very thing which I think we're unfairly criticised for at the moment. So I was trying to keep a respectable arm's distance to that, but that shouldn't be portrayed as anything other than it was. We had been engaged with people. We explained the rules as we saw them, and I was, as I said to Mike, I was very clear in that. PPS maybe think I shouldn't have been as clear, but I was clear that was the situation. That's the basis on which we work, and I encourage people to do all in their power to. And again, to be absolutely clear with you and Joanne, as you know, I will be in these things. My assumption always was that it was going to be a very difficult, if not impossible, and the likelihood was that there would be a degree of breach. That was again a working and planning assumption, and our ability to respond to that by way of gathering the evidence, reporting it to the PPS with a recommendation for prosecution was merely the follow through on that.
Okay. My other questions still relate to engagement. Did your liaison person make you aware that the return of the remains and the hours of the wake were being widely publicised on social media to encourage people to come? And did any other member of the executive team liaise formally or informally with the liaison person?
There were a number of points of contact, Joanne, across the period, as you can imagine, in an event like this, and the number of people who touched upon it, and the number of relationships they have with various police officers to the neighbourhood policing model. There are a number of touch points. So, and that information then gets fed back into the control room. It's a 24/7 operation. None of us are available 24/7. Obviously, we do rotate the command structure around that, but it was all against the consistent backdrop of explaining the regulations to people, encouraging their compliance, and we believed there was going to be a breach, that we would gather the evidence in relation to it and report it.
I have in my possession a document emanating from Londonderry, which says, which refers to black and whites, and says that they, quote, need B&Ws to be in place at 8:30 a.m. to be briefed by Belfast comrades. As the cortege makes its way to Milltown, only B&Ws can fall in behind it. Are you clear that the stewards and the security company, because comrades is a very specific term, are you clear that the stewards and or the security company were not part of or linked to a prescribed organisation?
Again, Joanne, I'm aware and was aware at the time of the event organising company behind the event. In fact, we heard from them in one of the meetings with the Silver Commander about how they intended to do their function on the day. And again, that was a basis of us understanding so that we could plan for policing operation on the basis of no promises, no surprises. What I didn't get into, this is a company that police have worked with regularly on a number of events across Belfast. So we were familiar with the company. What I didn't get into was checking individuals that were involved in that, because once again, I think we were circumspect about how close we got to the planning and how close we got to being outside what I would consider to be our remit. I welcome the fact that some responsibility was been taken by the organisers to help try and manage the very situation we were trying to avoid. But it's not my job then to go and individually vet those people and understand who an individual is, because I think at that point, I think I would run the risk in front of this board of being accused of being planning an operation, such as I think has been unfairly suggested at points. And we were circumspect and understanding our role and where our role started and where it ended and what our role wasn't.
Right, Chairman, with this I'll finish, but it's abundantly clear through the engagement, the police knew there were going to be significant breaches. And this is, I'm directing this to the Chief Constable now, because in any circumstances where the PPS points to police engagement and behaviour as a factor in a decision not to prosecute, we have a massive problem. No, actually, let me correct that. You have a massive problem. This is a scandal, and that's exactly what it is. It is an epic failure in terms of policing and justice. And as far as wider society is concerned, and the people who did abide by the regulations as they buried their loved ones and their friends, those people now consider that this is the evidence that we have moved beyond two-tier policing into two-tier justice, and that there's one rule for Republicans and another rule for everybody else. So, Chief Constable, how are you going to restore public confidence? And why, at this point, would anybody comply with the COVID regulations?
Firstly, in terms of my own appeal, which echoes others, the compliance with the COVID regulations, it's not about projecting the frustration with us at the moment in terms of how you perceive a policing operation as being conducted. It's about doing the right thing to protect yourself, family, loved ones, and others from the COVID virus, because whilst we're making progress with the vaccination, the virus still remains a real risk to public health. So I wouldn't let frustration with us get in the way of that quite legitimate wider endeavour, Joanne. And then in terms of the other issues of two-tier policing, I mean, it is an easy accusation to make, but I take you back to the commissioning document in April, which was the framework for policing all funerals across Belfast, recognising this was going to be a difficult issue. I know you will not accept this, but our intent from that point was to be even-handed with communities, with people who were grieving right across the district. And indeed, there will be other funerals that were policed in other parts of the country at that time. So I do recognise that people will see this in some terms as a scandal. I do recognise the fact that people are angry because they see that in certain terms there's one rule for one and then for another. That was not what we set out to do. I think Alan is very clear that we recognised there were a range of scenarios we had to plan for. We tried our best to do that. We thought we were being clear in terms of the strictures in relation to what was right, what was wrong. And we are generally, to be quite honest with you, trying to make sense of the fact that how legitimate engagement, which is, you know, has been the heart of not just funerals, but a raft of other things, from how we police bonfires, parades, other big events, has put us in this situation. Because on the one hand, we had to understand what was going on for not just the COVID regulations, but wider issues of public safety. And if we could have foreseen that genuine and sincere attempt to understand something could have so undermined where we're at, well, as I say, I think all of us would have reflected and done things differently and seen how we could have taken advice. And that was not a deliberate attempt to give any community or any individuals a free pass at the regulations, Joanne, because we are here to enforce and uphold the law. And we had the 4 E's approach, which included post-event investigation and sanction. And we went into this endeavour with an assumption that the independent investigator, Mark Webster, would follow the evidence and present his findings to the PPS, which is what he did with a recommendation for prosecution. So we find ourselves where we do, but we are surprised at the outcome.
Okay, thank you. Alan, quickly, and then we need to move on if we're going to go through the questions.
Apologies, Chair, because I mean, Joanne raises important points and there's a mixture of agreement and not on it. I've said consistently, Joanne, it was my assessment that there would be breaches. You and I agree on that. I just think by the nature of this event, everybody I've spoken to across Northern Ireland at any time would have said that up front, and that was our working assumptions too. So, you know, and it need to be clear, it's not a point of conflict between us. The PPS are equally clear that the regulations and that piece that referred to the regulations fundamentally undermined any ability. And they were asked a specific question, and they said, even if the police, and the question was asked of them, if the police had done no engagement, would you have been able to prosecute this case? And they said, no, we wouldn't, because of the regulations. Now, clearly, the engagement then goes on to be considered as a factor. Clearly, I welcome HMI looking into that, because this is something we do with event organisers across communities and across Northern Ireland, and we need to get this right. I said to you this morning, I expected to be in a place where we gathered the evidence, reported for prosecution, and saw the prosecutions flow from that. And I'm as surprised as anybody that it didn't. That's no disrespect to PPS making the decisions, and I welcome the clarity going forward that we'll get in addressing it.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. Dolores, and then Dolores will be followed by Trevor.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Chief Constable. I think we're nearly forgetting who organised the event. You know, there was a political party at the heart of government, and in fact, the Joint First Minister. Now, there were legislators at the event, legislators who brought those COVID regulations before this Assembly and who voted on them and voted for them. And it's incredulous, absolutely incredulous to anybody that they did not understand. I don't know how people did not get what stay at home meant. Over 12, I think now we were told earlier today, over 12,000 people died in the past year. And the vast majority of those people, those bereaved families knew what the regulations meant around funerals. So Chief Constable, can I ask, did the Sinn Féin organisation plan that was provided to the police have figures in terms of how many would be in attendance at the funeral and the other associated events? Were figures provided to you? And can the board have a copy of that plan with the members' names redacted, if need be, that the police based their planning around?
Yeah, thanks, Dolores. Well, I think for a few comments there. I mean, I share your sort of emotion in terms of incredulous, because I don't want to gainsay where HMIC will go, and I'm sure Alan will have his own views and others involved in this, but this wasn't the first funeral that was going to take place after the regulations were passed. And at the very basic level, regardless who anybody was, the basic message was stay at home and respect the regulations, which is why I'm surprised personally that, notwithstanding the independence of the PPS, that we find ourselves in this situation. Alan was very clear about his planning assumptions. I thought we were clear in terms of the investigation. And indeed, I think the investigating officer was clear on his conclusions and recommendations. So we will have to wait and see if there's anything the PPS are going to do. And that's got to be a matter for them now in their review. The plan, or I think having seen it myself, I would concur with Alan. It feels more like a risk assessment than a plan, but we can all have different perceptions and understandings. Did contain figures. As best as I understand it, I hadn't seen the plan at the time. I've seen it since. Those figures were around the number of 30. So that the plan will clearly now form part of the HMIC review because it's integral to the timeline we have, which we described to you this morning in terms of the contact we had. So we're quite happy to make that plan available to you. I just think we need to take advice through the Chief Executive probably about whether we make that plan available very quickly or wait to see what HMIC themselves think so that we don't frustrate any sort of judgments from their process. But it will eventually, will either come to yourselves, I'm sure, or into HMIC, and then doubtless, I would presume, be reflected somewhere in their determinations.
Thanks, Chief. You know, you would have to wonder, you know, were the commitments that were given to the police honoured? You know, were they honourable commitments? Because I can tell you, it didn't look like it on the streets of Belfast. It did look like the Republican movement took over Belfast, and it's a very bad look. And there's been a lot of hurt, as I said earlier, caused. and damage done to policing, and that's bad for all of us. I'm not sure, Chair, if you just want me to ask, I mean, the police have had some recent successes, but there was a spotlight programme in relation to East Antrim UDA, and I just wonder if you're going to continue with the same level of figure and we can expect to see more action, because it's long past the time that these paramilitaries and criminal gangs were put out of action. And also that I would urge, not only against dissidents, because there has been recent successes in Lurgan, but also in terms of the UVF in East Belfast, that there's, despite all of this, that the morale can remain high within your officers, and that they will go after those criminals that put so many of our young people and children at risk with their drugs.
Thank you, Dolores. Well, I think the shame of where we find ourselves is that actually, and obviously cautious because there's a number of live investigations now that I wouldn't want to get in the way of, but it's very clear in the public domain the determination we've shown in recent months to confront terrorists, to tackle serious organised crime groups, and respond to other forms of paramilitary activity. Chief Superintendent John Mervyn, particularly, and his team of detectives have been pursuing this vigorously, as have the counter-terrorism detectives led by Chief Superintendent Raymond Murray, and that resolve remains unabashed, notwithstanding where we find ourselves. You'll see this week we've had our largest ever seizure of drugs in terms of cannabis. It was in the news yesterday. So that we have to obviously be in a situation at the moment where we recognise the widespread public opprobrium, I suppose, of where we find ourselves. But actually the resolution of the organisation is we keep answering the phone, we'll keep turning up to emergencies, and we'll keep investigating crime, because that's what we have all joined to do. And we need to make the space for a small number of us to let matters take their course while we cooperate with HMIC, and then we'll see what their conclusions mean for our policy and tactics going forward.
Sure, we could just finish by saying I think public confidence in policing will be much encouraged by continued action against those who do the most harm in society today.
Thank you.
I agree with you, Dolores, because at the end of the day, it's that difference between words and deed. And I do pay tribute to the diligence of not just detectives, a whole range of officers that have been on the front foot in recent months to deal with some of the scourges that society faces.
Okay, thank you. Next up is Trevor, and Trevor will be followed by Tom Buchanan. But firstly, Trevor Clarke. Trevor.
Thank you, Chair. And I suppose I want to start off with saying that I never was very good at school, and I'm glad I wasn't a school teacher, because I was marking the senior management team of police. I was marking this as an epic fail. Now, that said, I have to say, and I want to put this on before I ask my question, I actually feel sorry for the rank and file officers who are meeting a day on daily basis, who are out in the street, because I feel sorry for them in terms of the barrage that they receive because of some of the actions that's been handed down. But can I ask specifically, in relation to the report, page 5, paragraph 6, and it says, I want to read this one because I think it's important. On the 26th of June, the police decided that it was not proportionate to intervene following reports of approximately 400 persons being visible in the area of the Storey home. This was following a discussion with the lead Sinn Féin organiser, in which the police were advised that stewards were in place to encourage social distancing. Can I ask you, Chief, or indeed Alan, if there's a funeral in my area or anyone else's area, and they need over 400 people outside the home, does this suggest that if Sinn Féin give you some form of insurance, that there will be no prosecutions or fines, or do we need some other political parties to intervene, or what is this? What is the message here to other people who would read this paragraph?
Alan, this, in fairness, Trevor, was a response that wasn't actually led by Alan. So the detail was another senior officer. Is there any broader clarity you want to bring, notwithstanding this will probably feature in HMIC's review?
I'm happy to lift it with Trevor. So Trevor, my understanding, having sought this, was there was an impromptu number of people. I mean, I'm not going to argue with crowd. There were people who were there who shouldn't have been there. And there were quite a few people when the hearse was returning to the Storey home, lined the routes in small groups. We became aware of that as it was happening. And, we didn't have an operation in place to deal with that immediately. So there was an engagement with the organisers and Sinn Féin to understand what was happening and what the intentions were. That was to inform us as to, was that likely to be something that lasted 15 minutes or go beyond that? Clearly, it was going to take us a finite period of time to place an operation. And as you say, I owe it to the rank and file who we deploy into the ground to do that in a structured, managed, controlled and safe way in the numbers required. That can't be done in 5 minutes. And we were told that those people had come out to see the hearse arriving home and would be encouraged to disperse quickly. My understanding, that's what happened before police deployed it. But again, this is something HMI can look at more closely in the review. But it wasn't a deal. It wasn't an arrangement. We really sought to understand what was happening so we could understand how we responded to that. But like you, Trevor, I always have the utmost regard for the people and a duty of care to the people that I deploy into those situations. And it's not the sort of thing I could send two police in a car to into West Belfast in those circumstances without plan and thoughtful approach. We were seeking to inform that approach, and in any case, those numbers dispersed and went home before that would have been a police response. People may view that as being an imperfect piece, but that is what happened.
I can accept you wouldn't send officers to that given the number of people there on, but on many other occasions and on many other funerals, retrospectively, were fines issued.
We weren't in a position to gather the identity of those present, Trevor, and regrettably, we have found ourselves in this position with a number of funerals across Northern Ireland in a number of places where they have happened at short notice and exactly the same thought process and exactly the same approach. And frankly, have people breached the regulations and not been detected for it? Yes, they have. Is that a matter of regret for me? Yes, it is. But equally, I won't put my people in harm's way by responding in a way that's not appropriate, because that ultimately leads to unnecessary risk to the officer and indeed the people that are there themselves, and I have to balance those risks as senior officer, and I try to do my best doing that.
Can I ask you specifically then, Simon, in response to Dolores, where I think it was Dolores asked you about the plan, and you said the plan referred to 30 people. However, in the report it suggests in page 5, paragraph was that 7C, it said that there was 30 invited guests and positions for up to 94 persons in proximity to the Republican plot. How does that sit then with the coronavirus regulations, given that you knew as part of the plan beforehand that at this stage there was going to be at least 124?
I think just have to be careful here, Trevor. I don't want to be defensive, but the danger here is the PPS make reference to the number 30. And I'm conscious that the plan will be central to HMIC's review and indeed the interpretation that other people may put on that. So I don't want to start doing mental maths myself and sort of be accused of putting myself before someone else's chance who was actually there on the day to interpret what that meant. So I just think the numbers are in the public domain there. How that was described and understood will be a matter for HMIC to make sense of. And I just think it's best to leave it there at the moment.
And you may feel that, Simon, and I appreciate that. However, it is in a public report that's in the public domain, and it refers to the 94 and also refers to the 30. And you yourself put the public domain in response to Dolores in relation to the plan that there was 30 individuals. Can I ask then, over and above the 30 individuals and the other 94 that's referred to in the report, how many stewards / comrades were allowed for as part of the procession, Alan?
Alan was going to come in, I think, on the last point as well. So, Alan, yeah.
I said this to a number of answers, Trevor. Just it was my assessment throughout this that there was likely to be more people than were permitted, and it was my assessment that would breach the regulations. That my assessment we were required to gather the evidence of that for the PPS for prosecution, in the expectation that those prosecutions would follow. So I mean that has been our working assumption throughout this. So whilst the numbers in the risk assessment scope plan relate to that, it was always my assessment that that's where we would end up. Now, as it happens, the PPS have decided that actually the people didn't break the law in the first instance. That's we've been around that one, and I'm as surprised as anybody else in that, because that was not the working basis for the operation. So, you know, those numbers merely indicated what I felt and what I planned for throughout, is that it was highly unlikely that this funeral would pass off with 30 or fewer people at it.
Can I specifically tie you down, because you've said in an earlier answer that you've worked with this security company or comrades before. How many people are indicated who are going to be stewarding at this particular procession?
Again, Trevor, the number wasn't indicated to me, and again, I didn't ask. I merely reminded those organising it of their responsibilities under the health protection regulations.
And you also said in the previous answer to myself about you did appreciate that there would probably be an excess of the numbers, and what your operation would be centering around gathering intelligence. Would you accept then that you failed miserably at the Lake House, where in your own words that you haven't got the evidence in relation to the 400 participants who were there?
I accepted, Trevor, that there were more people at the funeral than I anticipated, and people falling in behind, people who were there to marshal and there to help protect or help adherence to the regulations. It wasn't my expectation that they would fill in there and indeed congregate in the Milltown Cemetery. So those things were above what I expected. And I've been clear about that both in the media this week and my answers to the board this morning. As I said, I'm answering for an operation when I was off duty, but equally, you know, there wasn't the anticipation of the numbers that turned out to, you know, quite spontaneously from their homes in the area when Mr. Storey's hearse arrived, which is why it was of such a short duration, as I understand it, and they returned back home. So, you know, there's some social media footage of how that happened, and others will judge whether there should have been an intervention or not. But again, that's what HMI will help us understand from an independent perspective.
Sorry, did I just pick up in your last answer there that given, I mean, we all appreciate that you were the gold commander around the coronavirus stuff. Are you only after saying actually, and given the seriousness of this funeral, did you say actually you weren't on duty that day?
That's correct, Trevor. It's a 24/7 operation, and you know, I don't work 24/7, and neither did any of the team.
Nor did I say, but given, I suppose, the high-profile event in terms of funeral and the fact that you're the gold commander, I find it incredulous that you wouldn't have been there during the procession itself.
No, sorry, Trevor.
The other thing, if I let me finish my question, the other thing I want to ask in terms of who was in senior command, were they in direct contact with any of the stewards, marshals, or Sinn Féin representatives on the day, or actually during the time of the funeral procession?
Trevor, apologies, we're at cross purposes here. I wasn't on duty the evening of the body returning home to Mr. Storey's home. I was on duty the day of the funeral, as you might expect.
Right, okay. So, given that you were in gold command during the day of the procession, were you in contact with any marshals, stewards, comrades, or Sinn Féin representatives during the time of the funeral?
No.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. We've got a few more questions to get through. I'd like to try and get everybody in who has shown that they want to come in. Next up is Tom Buchanan, and Tom will be followed by Michael Atkinson. So, Tom Buchanan.
Thank you, Chair, and I'll be as brief as I can. Chief Constable, in relation to the issue before us today and in light of the PPS report, not only is the position of your officers who work with our respective communities on a daily basis been seriously compromised, but your position has been left untenable in that you have lost all the confidence and trust of the unionist community. And indeed, I have to say that you've lost the trust and confidence of some of your officers on the ground who work within the community. So that is a fact that is out there, and whether we like it or we don't, we have to present the facts as they really are. And I want to look at this planning of this event again, just a few questions within it as well, following on from Trevor, because earlier on in the private session today, when questioned on this, Alan Todd, you told me that while you had received a plan of the event by email, you hadn't responded to it. However, whenever we look at the PPS report, it says that on the 24th of June, police were aware that Sinn Féin were preparing a management plan for the funeral, and police intended to complement that plan. And also then 2 days later, on the 26th of June, police requested a meeting with the lead Sinn Féin organiser in order to ensure a good mutual understanding of the plan. So therefore, not only I believe it was wrong to say that the plan hadn't been responded to, because here we have it in black and white within this particular document. And it also says about police that they were asked to assist in searching the grounds prior to the funeral, as there would be senior Sinn Féin representatives who would be at the funeral, and the request for these searches was agreed. Now, in questioning today again in the public session here, you have said that really it wasn't really a plan from Sinn Féin as such. It was more of a risk assessment from the events organising group. And Chief Constable has said exactly the same thing. So can we get some clarity as to who this plan came from? Was it actually from Sinn Féin? Was it from the event organising group? And the Chief Constable talked about receiving a plan on the 28th of June. Yet this meeting that was requested with Sinn Féin to look at the plan was requested on the 26th of June. So, there's so much ambiguity here. Perhaps we can get some clarity on.
Well, if I can begin, Tom, I think a lot of this is, I go for the chair here, but is probably best placed in the domain of HMIC, because the danger is when we're just looking at partial views of this, where some of us are looking at the PPS report, some of us are reflecting on what we said in the private meeting, we could end up talking ourselves in knots and just adding to the confusion, because there will eventually be a fairer determination about what we were sent. Is it a plan, a risk assessment, or whatever? Because it's just a shorthand. Alan and I would probably shut our eyes and see what a policing plan looks like. Others may determine in event management, well, that looks like a plan to me. So I don't want to start sort of splitting hairs there. I think it's also a matter of fact, which is the plan that is the heart of this is received on the 28th. It wasn't sent to me, it was sent to Belfast. And then the policing operation took place on the 30th, Tom. So the detail of what that in real terms would independently be seen as an assessment of that document and how fair it was to take heed of it or not, I think it's best placed to be answered by HMIC, because we could just end up confusing each other at the moment.
Alan, yeah.
Thanks, Chair. I'm just kind of, Tom asked some other aspects, which I do think, and I accept the Chief's piece on the plan. Tom, there was a request made in the Belfast district, and sorry, the plan or risk assessment, call it as you will, in my understanding came from the event management company. That's my understanding of it. There was a request, and I mean, this is in the public domain, so, and you've asked the question, Tom, and I think you're due clarity, as are everybody else, just to be absolutely clear why we did what we did. There was a request that asked if the police would consider a search in relation to both the church premises and indeed the cemetery plot. That request was made of one of my supervisors in the team, and was brought to me for consideration. In making a decision to do that, I considered the history and potential issues surrounding large funerals. And I did think, and I said this, the working assumption was this was going to be one of the larger funerals, particularly of the personalities involved and particularly of the background in that context. And I considered whether under the Police Act and my responsibility and the organisation's primary responsibility to protect life and provide for public safety, whether that would be a reasonable thing to do in the circumstances. And I decided on a professional basis that it would be. And people should really understand that that was done entirely on that basis, understanding the context of funerals in Belfast, understanding how and what might take place, and the potential for that, and the risk, and my responsibilities under the Police Act, I authorised that search activity. And nobody should see anything else in that other than it was professional decision made for professional reasons under the Police Act, which guides this organisation.
Can I ask them, did the police give their full support to this plan or this risk assessment, whatever you want to class it? From the report here as classed as a plan that would have come from Sinn Féin leadership. So either, Sinn Féin organisers, so either the plan is wrong or the report is wrong and the police is right, or the report is right and the police is wrong. There's some that can't be both ways. But the reporters are referring to it as plan that come from the lead Sinn Féin organiser, and we all know who that is because that was revealed this morning. But were the police satisfied with that plan, that risk assessment, whatever you want to call it? Were they satisfied with that was the way to move forward in this situation?
No, it wasn't a matter of being satisfied, Tom. We used it as information as to what was likely to take place in the day, so that we understood how we could best plan for policing operation. We didn't ask for the plan. We didn't critique it. We didn't send it back. We didn't approve it, and I wouldn't have done any of those things, because my concern was that to do so would leave us in the very place that we've tried to stay away from. And I think I'm not going to argue with the PPS report on this either. My assessment is the plan was drafted by the organisers, but it was sent to police by the Sinn Féin organiser. And so, just to try and clarify, I'm not arguing the point, but I don't think my understanding was that it was prepared by the event management company. It was sent to us by the senior Sinn Féin manager or organiser. But no, I didn't agree to it. I didn't ask for it. I didn't approve it. Didn't critique it. I didn't respond to it. And I didn't want to do that because I was very keen and clear about keeping the police to our role in this.
And did you make the Sinn Féin organiser and the events management company aware of the fact that police were not satisfied with this particular plan?
Again, Tom, my decision at the time was not to respond to it, because any response critiquing it, accepting it, or otherwise would have been seen as exactly that which is being tried to be portrayed at the minute, which is an assessment I don't agree with. And I
well, sorry. If you didn't respond to it, why then has this report got it in the thing that the police requested a meeting with the lead Sinn Féin organiser in order to ensure a good mutual understanding of the plan? Now, if you didn't respond to it, is this report wrong?
You're on mute, Alan.
Apologies, Chair. There's buttons. We didn't respond to the plan, Tom, and the Zoom meeting that the Silver Commander had set up with the organisers was again so we fully understood what was intended on the day and what was likely to happen, so we could plan accordingly.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, Chair, thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Okay, the last few questions. Next up is Michael Atkinson, and Michael will be followed by Edgar Jardine. Michael.
Hi, good afternoon, Chief Constable. I'm hoping you can hear me okay. I'd maybe just switch the focus or direction a bit onto your report, which was very well constructed, and thanks very much for that. You did touch on page 35 on issues related to gender-based violence, and I just wanted to direct a question along those lines, in that overall you're seeing the levels of gender violence down, but particularly attacks on women are rising. And just to refer back on the basis of that to a recent interview with Sir John Gillan on BBC Radio Ulster's Evening Extra, which was linked to the report and recommendations made following the high-profile rugby players' rape trial in Belfast in 2018 into how sexual offences were to be dealt with in Northern Ireland. And he commented that it has taken too long in getting these things through. Now, recognising that a lot of those recommendations were attached not necessarily to PSNI, but had a strong Department of Justice input as well, and needed the changes to be backed across the executive. I did want to ask you how you feel work is progressing within the PSNI in preparation for the changes required to support Sir John Gillen's recommendations as they impact on PSNI, given the public interest attached to related issues, including the recent increase in violent attacks against women in Northern Ireland.
I think, Chair, it's probably a good opportunity to bring the deputy's patient who's been on the call today is now our operational lead for performance. So perhaps it's to give him a chance to give his perspective on this important issue.
No, thank you, Chair. Apologies, I lost the signal there for a moment, Michael, so I had to just dial back in. We've been preparing for the Gillen work since before the report came out, and that includes the shape and construct and structure of our public protection unit. I think the issue at the minute, because of the issues around violence against women and girls that have most prominently come to light across the entirety of the UK in the last 4 weeks, have made it even more important. And I've also been working with National Police Chiefs Council around the National Police Chief's position on violence of women and girls, and also the issues falling out of misogyny and such like behaviour. So, I mean, we are keen to get on with it, Michael. The justice system obviously has to have all their apparatus strapped around it. But I think, you know, setting aside some of the other very pertinent issues we've been talking about today, this lines itself up as probably a key priority for the next financial year for the police service and for the board, and holding us to account around the domestic violence levels, domestic violence clearance levels, rape, and there's a major issue being talked about nationally about rape attrition rates. There's a acceptance across UK policing and across UK criminal justice that the attrition rate for rape is not acceptable. There's a major piece of work going on through National Police Chiefs Council around that. Alongside that, then we're also looking then more broader at these issues of harassment and stalking. Baroness Williams in the House of Lords 2 weeks ago has asked that police services in England and Wales start to record hostility motivation based upon sex in relation to violence against the person, stalking, harassment, and sexual offences. So we now have to consider whether or not locally we will do this. We will do similarly. It's not to be treated as a hate crime, but that's also something that we're bringing forward for conversations in the next few weeks. So quite a bit of work, Michael. I think we'd all like to get to see Gillen fully implemented. It's certainly an interest of the public, particularly an interest of the women in our society who have been victims of rape, and obviously rape, assault also covers, you know, against men as well. But there's clearly a more work to be done there, and we're very keen to get on with it.
Okay, thanks very much, Mark. I mean, I think given the structure of the reporting is sort of improving very significantly on your side, I think it might be useful to touch on a month-on-month basis, just in terms of maybe even reference to the Gillen recommendations and how you're doing against that. The other point is you're sort of mentioning the wider view and the activities taking place across the UK. I know we've spoken before about the difficulties in benchmarking, but I must say it is one of my hobby horses, and I think it would be helpful if you continue to sort of strive to be able to bring that sort of wider context into how you're getting on with some of these metrics, which are, you know, usefully presented in the report at the minute in terms of trends and measures. But I think it would be helpful if it's at all possible to aspire to that in the future, you know.
Well, absolutely. I mean, we've made a lot of progress, we hope, in the performance reporting for the service. I'm very keen to take feedback from the board about the report cards that we're sending forward, so that the information has utility. The big issue we're trying to crack at the moment, Michael, is not just the data, but what the data says. So we're trying to create a police service that doesn't just look backwards at what's happened, but uses the data to say, well, what does this mean? How does that then line up with the Chief Constable's vision around the crime prevention strategy for the service? How does that line up around our detection strategies, our sexual offences strategies, our domestic abuse strategies, our arrest strategies, and so forth? So there's a lot of work here, but I think we've come a long way in the last 12 months, and I'm very happy to take suggestions from the board about how we can provide more data to you. I think what I would encourage from all sides in this, as we look at that data, is to generate the questions that come from it as well, because we don't always have all the questions that need to be asked.
Appreciate that, and thanks for your answer, Mark. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Michael. The final questions now, the first one is from Edgar Jardine, and then the last question I've been notified of is John's return to the questions John had. not covered before. If there's anybody else who hasn't spoken who feels that they would need to be in before we close, Tom Frawley. Okay, Tom, we'll come to you after that. Then we'll finish off. So Edgar next, Edgar Jardine.
Thanks, Chair. Like Michael, I want to pick up on the Chief Constable's annual report. And again, just to thank them for a comprehensive report, which demonstrates evidence of progress across a whole range of your areas of responsibility, not least the tackling serious organised crime. But I want to refer to page 16-17 of the report, which describes a significant expansion of the PSNI virtual infrastructure to enable remote working, including deployment of 4,500 remote working laptops and extended virtual conferencing capability. Obviously, such an expansion brings with it additional cybersecurity risks and exposure. Can the Chief Constable assure the board of the protocols and safeguards in place to ensure the security of the PSNI networks as a result of this expansion?
I'll take that for you if you wish, Chief. If you want me.
It's okay. I just it's just easy to just quickly do it. To respond if you want, Mark, is I think it's probably best we brief elsewhere about the specifics, given the likelihood of tempting fate. But confident that we have a very robust infrastructure, operates in the governance terms of these things at the highest level across the UK. And there are also operating protocols to manage how people work from home or other places so that information isn't lost in that space. But I do pay tribute to a raft of colleagues that have worked at pace to roll out these laptops, because it was one of the single things that enabled us to keep going at the height of the pandemic when we had to adapt our posture and policing style. And we want to continue to invest this year in the ruggedized laptops you see on page 17, I think it is, which will be, I think, a game changer in terms of how frontline colleagues will be able to respond to calls, frankly, but also to recover information from victims and witnesses in the field and speed things up.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, Chief.
Thank you. John, your other question.
Chairman, yes, thank you. And this goes back again to the Chief Constable's report, for which we're grateful, and probably relates most to the Community Relations Task Force update in that report. And I'm going to say that figures show that COVID fines issued relate disproportionately, it would seem, to people from a BAME background. And the same could also be said for stop and search statistics. Would the Chief Constable like to reflect on those facts today? And can he give us any update on work being done to try and overcome this apparent disparity? And if that requires further conversations to this board, either through the Partnership Committee or directly with the board, I'm very happy with that.
Yeah, thanks, John. I mean, that's, again, given the breadth of stuff we've talked about today, another really important issue. Obviously, we set up the Community Relations Task Force to look at issues like this in the round, but we are acutely conscious of the perceptions of disproportionality and how we use powers. That's why we're keen on a continuing conversation with the board about scrutiny, about any one of a number of things. For example, you quite rightly touch on issue of fixed penalty notices. You can extend that to community resolutions, to cautions, and of course to use of force and stop search, which are so much in the public domain at the moment in terms of scrutiny of police activity. So I would actually welcome more scrutiny of this to give us that reassurance, and are keen on working with the board about how we bring that together so that, in a sense, we're not always accused of marking our own homework here. I also think pay tribute actually to the independent advisory group members, which has recently been formed, and I think have really helped us make sense of our thinking and our response to some of these difficult issues. And I look forward to their continued support and how we've evolved that model over the next 12 months. And I think the final thing to say is, it's touched on in the report elsewhere, but clearly understanding our communities is vital to getting our balance right. Of course, it relates to the big issue we're talking today about the two-tier policing question, but also recognising society is changing, which I think the census is so important. So we get that granularity, frankly, across the country about where different communities are changing, and we can adapt our style and policy to reflect that.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chief Constable.
Okay, thank you. Tom Frawley, final question.
Chair, just to say that, again, I commend the Chief Constable for the excellent report and indeed the progress that clearly is reflected in that report across so many fronts. I think we can't leave today's meeting, however, without expressing or recording concerns around one fundamental issue that never gets or hasn't been spoken about today, and that's our budget for next year. And I think there's a sense in which we are moving forward, but that progress, I think, is at risk if we don't secure the budget that we need even to stand still. And my sense is that that clearly is not yet established as a position, and indeed, from the advices we've received, it might well be a position that is not achieved. So I just would ask the Chief Constable and indeed our Chief Operating Officers who's with us, if that's more appropriately pitched to her, the implications of us not getting the budget that we had hoped for.
Thank you, Tom. I will bring Pamela in because obviously it's really welcome to have her vast experience to help us plan and prepare how we use resources in a different way going forwards. The likely lion's share of difference that the public will see if this isn't remedied will frankly look like slower investigations, maybe less police officers doing road safety activity, and also less capability to deal with protest and the extreme of public order, because the less officers will have to fall from somewhere if we're committed to keeping neighbourhood policing at the current levels and also to responding to emergency calls. So this is a really difficult issue for us, which we will make finally balanced professional decisions. But let's bring Pamela in just to share what she's done behind the scenes to try and remedy this and our plans in the next few months.
Yeah. Thank you, Simon. Yes, Tom, I mean, we've provided you with a resource plan for the incoming year and have sought to communicate what those impacts would be, as Simon has referred to. We have given commitments that if we have savings to make against our budget in 21-22, that we would prioritise that against workforce, both officers and police staff. We've been welcoming your support as a board and supporting us in that, and we've had very strong and positive dialogue both with the Department of Justice and Department of Finance on that. I understand that there's been conversations at the executive today on the budget, so I'm not trying to completely preempt where that has gone, but I'm getting texts as I sit in this meeting saying that that's looking quite favourable for us. So it is sounding like we will be able to continue with our recruitment both into the police officer numbers and police staff into 21-22, which is fantastic. And we have pressures, remaining pressures there, circa £13 million that we will need to secure through non-pay aspect of our business. But I'm confident that we can do that without significant impact on the operational delivery of our business. So just on the finer outworkings from the executive today, but it is looking very promising.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Well, it's nice to end on some good news as far as that goes. I know Mervyn wants to say a few words, which I think will express sentiments we all want to express with regard to the attacks in Londonderry.
Yes, Chair, it is, and I don't want to detract from anything else that's been said. But given the nature of the report that we had today, because it was an end-of-year report, I haven't seen anything in relation to particular incidents, and I think it has to be recorded the condemnation of the attacks in Londonderry against police officers. Anyone who has seen the footage of what has gone on over the last number of weeks is disgraceful. We are thankfully, no officer was seriously injured. That could have been easily different given some of the footage that we've seen. So I want the Chief Constable to convey to those officers who so many times are forgotten in all of the discussions that we have in terms of many other things, that we appreciate what they do and condemn the awful attacks on them in Londonderry and in any other places where cars were around or where there was any attack on police officers doing their job to keep us all safe. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And we all echo those sentiments as a board. Simon, please pass it on to all of your officers. That concludes our session. I'm very grateful to all taking part in an open and a reasoned and reasonable way. We have reached the end, as I say, and we will clearly be reporting back in terms of the request to the Minister to engage with HMIC FRS. That will be coming back swiftly to us. I've already spoken to the department and also indeed to the inspectorate on the subject, so I expect quick answers on that front. Today's meeting, and I should say meetings, because we had an extensive meeting, as I said at the beginning, to question the Chief Constable, have been lengthy but appropriate. They've been predominantly on the big subject of the day and of the moment, the PPS report, and quite rightly so. We recognise the public concern around all of that, and I suppose the figures I've been given, which show that we've had over 500 people logged into our live stream today, believe me, that's an exponential growth on what we normally get in terms of those who watch live stream, again just shows the interest in this particular subject. So thank you to all board members for the way in which they've conducted themselves, and thank you to the Chief Constable and his team for the open and frank way in which they have answered. We are due to meet again in terms of public session on Thursday, the 6th of May. Until then, I wish all who are on the board and associated with the PSNI, and to all who have linked into the meeting today, a very happy and a peaceful Easter. Thank you for joining us.